And then in like 30 seconds, I'll open it. We already have 102 people in the waiting room here.
Right.
Great. The
One of
sequel's
you
all
can scratch your head like Justin. You can like, if I'm going, I mean, I have a little script and I want to go for the 10 or 15 minutes, but I didn't really time it all out. So
Well, there's a little bit of leeway here because we have one less
speaker than last
contributor
time.
speaking today. So you
Yeah.
you have a little extra time if you want to do
okay,
it.
all right.
So I wouldn't worry too much. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and open it up. So keep the chitter chatter down. All right, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Fallingwater webinar series. Today we're talking about our new publication, Fallingwater Living with and in Art. I'm just going to wait a minute or two as our participants start signing into the webinar. So we'll get started here in just about a minute or two. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. We're just waiting for, I see participants are still joining on to view the webinar with us today. So we'll get started here very shortly. We're just waiting a couple minutes here as participants join into the webinar. We'll start very soon. All right, well, hello everyone. My name's Justin Gunther. I'm the director here at Fallingwater, and thank you for joining our Fallingwater webinar series. Today is the second of a two-part series where we're discussing our new publication, Fallingwater Living with and in Art. And I'd like to begin by first thanking Scott Perkins. Scott is our Senior Director for Preservation and Collections here at Fallingwater, but the co-curator of the book as well. And Scott will be moderating our Q&A session at the end of the webinar. If you have questions as our presenters are giving their talks about their chapters, if you'll please use the Q&A feature on Zoom. Scott will monitor the questions that you ask in that field, and then we'll hopefully get to all of your questions after our presenters have had a chance to give their talks. So just enter in your questions into that Q&A, and we will be moderating that throughout the course of the webinar. But the idea for this publication came about a couple of years ago, where Scott and I had the desire to really delve into the fine and decorative art collection here at Fallingwater, which is truly a remarkable one that spans centuries and cultures. And we really wanted to use the art and objects of Fallingwater to reveal stories about the Kaufmann family, about Frank Lloyd Wright, and to give deeper insights into the artists and designers that created those objects, many of them specifically commissioned by the Kaufmanns for Fallingwater. And we decided to organize the book with a thematic geographical approach. So today you'll hear from James Oles on Mexican influences in the collection, Jeannine Falino on American craft, as well as from Glenn Adamson, who wrote the beautiful foreword for our publication, and Dave Bryce, who packed it full of just absolutely gorgeous new photography. And if you missed the first installment of this two-part series, the recording is available on our website and on our YouTube channel. And in that first series, the remaining contributors of the books presented on their chapters. So please do check that out. And if you'd like to purchase a copy of Fallingwater Living Within an Art, we have it available through our museum store. So you can access that store directly from fallingwater.org and then click on shop at the top bar navigation. You'll discover that publication there. In addition to lots of other great merchandise, and as the holiday season is upon us, please do check that out. We are offering a special edition limited run of Fallingwater Living with an art that will be signed by Scott and by me, and it's being offered with a print of the cover image of the books signed by the photographer Dave Bryce. So look out for that. We're only doing a limited run of that for this holiday season. I'd also like to extend thanks to Douglas Curran, architecture and design editor, Jacob Lehman, the assistant editor, and Charles Myers, our publisher for the book, all at Rizzoli Press. They gave us tremendous guidance throughout the process in creating this publication, and also special gratitude to the Anthony and Kiko Greenberg Foundation for their generous support of the book. And we are recording today's presentation. So shortly after we finish here today, the recording will be available again on our website and on our YouTube channel. So let's go ahead and get started with our presenters. The first will be Glenn Adamson, who wrote the book's foreword. And Glenn is a curator, writer, and historian based in New York and London. The author most recently of A Century of Tomorrows by Bloomsburg in 2024. But he's also currently the curator at large for the Vitra Design Museum in Germany, artistic director for Design Doha, and editor of Material Intelligence, a quarterly online journal published by the Chipstone Foundation. Some of Glenn's previous publications include Thinking Through Craft, Postmodernism, Style and Subversion, The Invention of Craft, and Fewer Better Things, The Hidden Wisdom of Objects. Current curatorial projects include Toshiko Taka. Glenn, I always get this name wrong. Toshiko Takaezu, Worlds Within for the Osamu Noguchi Museum, and Nike Form Follows Motion for the Vitra Design Museum. So Glenn, I'll turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you so much, Justin. Great to be with you all. I'm going to say this evening I'm beaming in from London, hence my nighttime lighting situation here. But of course, thoughts never far from Pennsylvania and Fallingwater. And it's a great pleasure to have had the chance to write the foreword for this beautiful book, and also to have a chance to just touch on a few of the ideas that I wrote about there. I suppose the key message that I wanted to deliver in the foreword, which really comes through loud and clear in the publication, is that modernism is not what its stereotypical image perhaps suggests it to be. And you can probably, if you have good eyesight, just make out my first line there, which is modernism has a reputation for absent-mindedness, which I suppose could be construed both as a sort of sealing off of history because of the intention to look forward and to emphasize narratives of progress. But I mean it in a more literal sense, absent-minded, in that modernist architecture has a reputation for being uncluttered, spare, depopulated of objects. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see the canonical example of this, which is, of course, Mies's Barcelona Pavilion, which tellingly was a piece of demonstration architecture, so not really meant to be lived in, certainly, not really even meant to be used for any purpose other than to be admired for its own glorious, serene self. And famously, the Barcelona Pavilion is incredibly rich and incredibly provocative in a visual sense, and certainly lacks nothing in that register, particularly because of the extraordinary materials that Mies used to build this incredible intersection of planes. But the actual object roster the way that the space is furnished was radically reduced, almost in anticipation of minimalist sculpture in the 1960s, as many people have commented. And even when you think about the objects that were there, like the Barcelona chairs, the famous Barcelona chairs, they too have this kind of exacting, rigorous relationship to form, not a stitch out of place. The metal framework of the chairs um, really being calculated to the absolute nth degree, providing absolutely what is needed and nothing more. And this idea of a kind of efficiency, which is an eloquent metaphor for the logic of the machine, for the kind of hyper rationalist version of modernism that's often associated with Mies and other figures at the Bauhaus, that wing of the Bauhaus, as I'm sure many of you know, it wasn't all like that. This has I think remained over the course of the last century very much the received idea of what modernism was in its essence. Now, that may or may not be true. I suppose it depends what you think the essence of modernism is, but certainly in practice, we can say that that was very much the minority of what actually happened, even in the most significant modernist projects. So if you go to the next slide, you already see in something like Corbusier's Unité d'Habitation in Berlin a slightly more ecumenical approach to furnishing. This is still fairly close to the Barcelona Pavilion end of the spectrum. You have the Prouvé chairs, of course, which have their own kind of relentless logic, although perhaps somewhat more allied to artisanal practice than the Barcelona chairs were, at least in their visual rhetoric. But you already start to feel what it might be like to inhabit one of these spaces. And I particularly like this image of the Unité d'Habitation that's in Berlin because of the Mac laptop that's on the desk slash dining table. The Mac, of course, itself being a great example of an object that presents itself as sleek, refined, reductive, just what it needs to be and nothing more, and yet turns out, of course, to be a kind of endless cascade of complexity and encounter, for better or worse. And I slightly wanted to say that modernism is a lot more like the inside of a Mac laptop than the outside, if you see what I mean. Or perhaps it serves as the perfect metaphor. And Johnny Ives and his crew at Apple, I think, were really onto something in the way that they were channeling modernism into those product designs. But in any case, if you go to the next slide, whatever we think about that cross chronological comparison, we could think about designers who emerged from that French modernist context, including Corbusier, but also Charlotte Perriand, his friend and colleague, and the way that they approached exhibition making as well as object making in this much more encompassing Catholic approach than one might think. And a great example of that would be this not very well known project that Perriand did during her brief controversial visit to Japan. As you notice from the date 1941, quite an interesting time for a French designer to be working in Japan, but off she went. And this is her installation at the Takamachi Maya department store, which was called Selection, Tradition, Creation, and was explicitly billed as a kind of projection of what the future might look like. So off in the distance, past the horizon of the now, we have these objects that yet, despite that kind of explicit futurity, have this extremely craft-based identity. And in particular, she's working with a local bamboo producer to make that furniture that you see in the foreground, just by way of example. So this very interesting idea that the future and the past are somehow allied or need to be seen in explicit discursive relationship to one another, which is something that we'll also see in the images of Fallingwater. Next slide. Perrion's photography could also be seen perhaps in a similar spirit. This is an image I absolutely love. You see that the title has that term art brut, which is very much associated with Jean Dubuffet as well. So the idea of a raw art, an unrefined, unprocessed art, raw in the same way that, you know, a vegetable you haven't put into your stew yet might be raw. And this is, of course, an image of a stone on a beach, and yet it looks kind of like a piece of jewelry. It certainly looks like a sculpture. That was really what she was thinking about. And this idea that this scene that after all could easily have occurred not just in historic times, but in fact primordial pre-human times. This photograph could have been taken millions of years ago if photography existed then. That could also be a kind of modernism. That idea that the deep past and the future, again, sort of shake hands in her work. Next slide. Here's Corbusier again, just to fill out this idea about the French take on modernism in a little bit more depth, and in a way that very clearly relates to what's happening at Fallingwater at the same time. These are two photographs taken 40 years apart, and as you can see on the left, Corbu actually has this vase, which was from Serbia, so a folk art vase, folk ceramic on his head, sort of, playing around with it. And then on the right hand side, you see him in later life with a few of the objects from his collection, which again was very eclectic, including, as you can see, a seashell, as well as these ceramics. And Tanya Harrod, the great craft historian here in London, has written very beautifully about the way that Corbusier made a special place for pottery in his interiors, which again might surprise you because you think of his interiors rather as being Mysian and unpopulated, much less populated by these extremely archaic seeming objects, vernacular objects, but they were precisely what he wanted to bring into those spaces. And as many of you will know, his architecture itself became more inflected with vernacular practice, whether it was the vault builders of Spain, or ultimately the local building techniques that he found in Chandigarh. So this is all to say that when we think of modernist architecture, even in its most purest forms, it turns out to actually be much more permeable than I think people tend to give it credit for. Next slide. Now, if we then pivot to the alternative forms of modernism, which might in some cases be so alternative that we're not really sure whether they deserve the name, then we realize that, of course, in the early 20th century, there are all sorts of models, all sorts of phenomena that, quite to the contrary of this idea of erasure or absent-mindedness, are absolutely filled with objects in this very affectionate, very emotive, almost familial way, and that in fact it would be very difficult to distinguish clearly between what some modernists decried as Victorian clutter and what actually happened under the aegis of modernist or at least avant-garde practice. And in a way, the exception that may or may not prove the rule here would be the Omega group gathered around Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant, and of course Roger Fry, Clive Bell, Virginia Woolf, that crowd, the Bloomsbury group when they were in London. But here, the famous studio space at Charleston, their great house in Surrey, south of me here, with its bric-a-brac and delight in pattern and mixture of antiques, including some ancient works like the sculpture above the mantelpiece there, the Buddhist sculpture above the mantelpiece, and the work that actually is being made by the inhabitants, and as well as roughly contemporaneous folk art. So all of this being mixed together. Next slide, another good example of this kind of syncretic approach would be the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia now, formerly in Marion. You all know this story well, but just to remind you that this idea of modernist painting being put into a kind of quasi-systematic pattern of arrangement by Barnes, really innate of his own particular aesthetic theories, which honestly have not aged nearly as well as the art that he collected, but nonetheless, again, present this idea of a kind of parity, or at least complementarity, between these different formal expressions. And in fact, form would be the right word here. The term that Clive Bell and Roger Fry both used, Bell having originated it, was significant form, which is one of those pieces of theory that more gestures at an idea than actually gives you one. But basically, the connotation is that some objects and some artworks have a kind of rightness or a kind of consequence that is almost self-evident, and that generates a necessity for interpretation and necessity for response, and that could just as easily be a pair of andirons or a hinge off a door, as it could be a Matisse painting. Next slide. The later example of this that would often be pointed to is Charles and Ray Ames' case study house and other projects of theirs. And I'm particularly thinking here of the work that Pat Kirkham has done on this house and on the Ameses, her concept of functioning decoration, which is to say a kind of, again, collecting practice really as much as design practice that has this somewhat instructive implication, rather like Barnes, and the idea that each of these objects individually, but also particularly them in combination, something you also see in the work of Alexander Gerard as a collector and designer, close friend of the Ameses, of course, from Cranbrook. This kind of totality or comprehensiveness is really intrinsic to what modernism becomes, particularly in America at mid-century, which of course is what Fallingwater is leading to. So next slide. That brings us to the main event, which is to talk about the house and Fallingwater. And I wanted to show these images, this spread from the important early publication done by MoMA in 1938 of the house, just to show you that, well, this in a way shows you why it's so important that this new book has happened, because I think this is the impression, certainly was the first impression of the house, and in a way it has remained the impression of the house, to wit, the important thing is the exterior, the incredible cantilevered sculpture of the house, the way it sits in nature, and it has this authority that derives from the combination of natural materials and geometry and engineering and Wright's personal vision. And that is what we should think about when we think about Fallingwater. And of course, those are all extremely important ideas, and that influence has been broad and sustained. However, the house's interior tells a much more complex and layered story than that. And, you know, it's fascinating to me that this first book about Fallingwater actually only included one interior shot, and this is it. You're looking at it, looking out from the living room. So even captioned as, you know, encouraging you to think beyond the walls. But also that the particular shot that was chosen of this built-in desk includes almost no objects, and mostly the objects that it does include are books, and you'll notice they're laying flat. So, you know, the bookshelves aren't even occupied by books practically. It's like everything has been compressed to this horizon line, which again, Frank Lloyd Wright was so well known for from his Prairie School work onwards. So again, it's this idea of a kind of elimination or deletion of incident to give you the emphasis of the strong lines, the interpenetrating forms, and the incredible volume and massing of this building, the way the light's filtering down and through these rectilinear shapes. So that's what the building is about. But then if you go to the next slide, lo and behold, actually there's all sorts of other stuff happening. So you have, for one thing, the inclusion of these extremely powerful singular anchor objects on the right hand side of folk sculpture. I think I can call it folk, let's say vernacular, or our self-taught artist Mardonia Magana on the right, and then on the left a salt glazed stoneware crock with cobalt decoration. So these singular objects that are placed at key points in the house, almost at these kind of hinge or juncture points. It's almost like they weren't thinking about feng shui, but you know, you think about the way that energy collects in a house, and it's almost like there's this attempt to gather those energies around these anchors, these sort of physical nodes that have a kind of gravitational relationship to the rest of what's happening in the composition. And if you look at the next slide, you'll then see how these objects could be placed into arrays, rather like, in fact, what Barnes was doing at his foundation, or even to some extent pushing it a little bit more, maybe what you know, the Bloomsbury Group or the Ameses did in their spaces. And I'm particularly interested in this shot, not just in the Brettstühlen, the board stools that you see in the foreground. Again, very, very vernacular, very rustic. But also the ceramics that are on the wall, and that particularly that bright green one there, which is a bull by Gertrude and Otto Natzler. Jeannine will talk more, I know, about the contributions of studio craftspeople that are present in the house, but that's such a kind of radiant and compelling object in this otherwise very reduced palette, and the way that it sits within the composition and sort of brings out the reds of the built-in elements, the way that it corresponds to the Native American Ola that's on the same shelf. You know, these conversations between objects across time and space and culture, it's almost like the house is built as a stage for that richness. And as you may know, at the moment that Fallingwater was being developed, the program at the Museum of Modern Art itself had that same kind of ecumenical quality. It did have shows on folk art. It did have shows on what we might now call studio craftspeople working in textiles, for example. And Edgar J. Kaufmann Jr. was very involved with that. So again, our idea of modernism as expressed in the museum complex in this sort of supposedly white cube, again, hyper rationalist way, that's really an imposition that came along later and only partially. And certainly in the years that Fallingwater was built, you would have had exactly the same kind of wide ranging and curious and informed relationship to what Fry and Bell called significant form as you do in the house itself. Next slide. This is just my last slide, and I suppose I'm including it partly for personal reasons because Peter Voulkos has long been an interest of mine, but again to show you the way that the far from the objects being incidental to the artwork, in some way they could also almost be seen to preside over the artwork and over the architecture. And here in particular, this unusually titled sculpture Funiculated Smog by Voulkos. By the way, that date is incorrect. It should say 1958. But this was a work that was acquired, I'm pretty sure, because Voulkos had an exhibition at MoMA in 1960, and I'm quite sure that this object would have come to the house because of that. But the idea that these individual artworks preside over the extraordinary quasi landscape of Wright's architecture and become the stars, become the main event, that is so compellingly present when you walk through the house. And what I think is so amazing about this book is that it actually brings that to you from afar. So even if you've never been to Fallingwater, or if you just don't happen to be there at the time and you have this book to page through, it reminds you of the fact that the architecture, for all of its charisma, all of its power, all of its innovations, also does serve as this suitable backdrop for the quote real art, which is, you know, works like this, works that you encounter throughout the house. And I think it's that both and togetherness of Fallingwater that makes it the incredibly enduring and fascinating place that it is. So I'll now hand over to the next speaker. Thanks very much for listening.
All right, Glenn, thank you so much for that introduction and dispelling this idea of absent-mindedness and introducing us to the richness and eclecticism that are the Fallingwater interiors. So we'll start diving into that. And we'll begin with James Oles. James is a specialist in Latin American art, focusing on Mexican art and architecture through museum as well as academic projects. He's particularly interested in the US-Mexican cultural interchange, with his first major project called South of the Border, Mexico and the American Imagination from 1914 to 1947 with the Smithsonian Institution Press. James has a BA from Yale, a JD from University of Virginia, and a PhD from Yale, and teaches at Wellesley, where he is also adjunct curator of Latin American art at the Davis Museum. He teaches in the spring semester at Wellesley, but spends most of his time in Mexico City, where he works as an independent curator and art historian. He's organized several major exhibitions in the United States and Mexico, often advising collectors, curators, and visiting scholars on the art world in Mexico. Two recent exhibitions with accompanying catalogs that he organized are Diego Rivera's America, the most important show on the Mexican artist in 2 decades, which was presented at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art and at Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, and Mexichrome, Color and Photography in Mexico, which opened in Mexico City in November of 2023. He's also advising the Museum of Fine Arts Houston on their upcoming Frida Kahlo exhibition, and is working on a book entitled Diego Rivera's Heroes, about artists that impacted Diego Rivera's work. So James, I'll turn it over to you to talk about connections between Mexico and Fallingwater.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Justin. And it's very interesting to be here. I actually now teach at Wellesley in the fall semester, so I am at Wellesley when the weather is better. So if I could have the first slide. I entered this project. I thought rather than really repeating what my essay is about, I kind of give some of the backstory to some things, but I entered this project through the doorway of Diego Rivera. I was rather late to get out to Fallingwater despite its reputation, and it wasn't until March of 2019 that one of my former Wellesley students, Jennifer Jostin, who's now a professor at the University of Pittsburgh in the art history department, brought me out to give a lecture and arranged a tour of Fallingwater, the morning tour when there's no people, and not so many people, and you can take more pictures, with some of her graduate students. And so I went out, and I really did not have Fallingwater on my radar at all as in any way a site of interest for Mexican cultural studies or art history. But as you walk around the house, of course, there are Mexican things everywhere, and Mexican things from different periods. Modern art, of course, I'll talk about that first, but also folk objects, 19th century paintings, and some 18th century objects as well. A very eclectic mix of things, a few things from elsewhere in Latin America, but mainly things from Mexico, and things of very ranging quality. Glenn was talking about, showing Corbusier placing a ceramic on a shelf, and surely some of the things at Fallingwater are, exquisite, fine and rare objects, but some of the Mexican pottery cost them about 5 cents and would be only worth about 10 cents in a flea market today. So they really had a very wide range of things on display, and I was fascinated. And as I walked through the house, of course, in this bridge area, I came across a painting by Diego Rivera that I was really only familiar with through a black and white photograph. And at that time, I was organizing the show out at SF MoMA. And so I was sort of taken aback. And after the tour was over, I found Scott, actually, and he was luckily in his office, and I introduced myself and said, we might be interested in borrowing the painting, the Diego Rivera there on the wall, for the show. And it became clear that I was actually surprised that it could be lent. And what I really wanted to do was to pair it with an almost identical picture that's now in a private collection. And in the end, that pairing became impossible. And for a variety of other reasons, we decided not to include the work in the show. But all that is to say that I think that is what fortunately got me on the radar for Justin and Scott to have the, I'd have to say to everybody, it's really like one of those dream projects where, we were all brought out to Fallingwater for, a kind of 2 or 3 day meeting where all the authors met. We talked with each other, but we're also able to go through the house and really experience Fallingwater in a way that is almost impossible unless you work there. So I really loved the fact that this Sleeping Girl by Diego Rivera opened the door for me. Could I have the next slide? one of the things I wanted to talk about is, and what I discovered is, I'll talk a little bit more about the Kaufmann's trips to Mexico, but very early in the 1930s, and I think probably from the time of Diego Rivera's retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1930-31, Rivera was really on the radar of anyone that was interested in modernism in the Americas. And certainly anybody that was connected to the Museum of Modern Art would have been deeply informed about the work of Diego Rivera. And so when the Kaufmanns first go to Mexico in the late 30s, they quickly gravitate towards Rivera and Kahlo. And I think in some ways, this overlaps with what Glenn was saying, or it complements what Glenn was saying, is that before the construction of Fallingwater, we already see this really an American example, or an example in the Americas of the high modernist, in this way, a very Corbusian project by the Mexican architect Juan O'Gorman, the studio complex that he built for the new couple, for Diego Rivera, it was designed soon after he married Frida Kahlo in 1929 on this open lot in the south of Mexico City. And what really was interesting, and I think perhaps in some ways might have inspired the Kaufmanns, is the way that Rivera and Kahlo, to a lesser extent, wanted to really identify himself visually and very loudly in a city of rather conservative buildings as a modern, machine age, factory-oriented artist. But that high modernism of the house, this double studio with its plate glass windows and factory roof and railings and all of this, was really ameliorated. The aggressive modernity was ameliorated not only by color, but by the cactus fence, the plantings around the house. And then in the interior, and you can see an interior shot on the left, taken soon after they moved in 1933, the way that much of the furniture was in fact vernacular. There was a lot of folk art, some pre-Columbian art, as well as even these woven straw mats or patates on the floor. So that was all designed to soften the modernism and kind of create a type of syncretic, traditional modernism or modernist tradition that was similar to what Diego Rivera's own paintings were, deeply informed by Cubism, but ultimately this type of social realism that focused on Mexican subjects. So even today, when you go to this studio complex, you walk through, and it's very similar to Fallingwater in that there are, vernacular and high art objects distributed all around the house. Could I have the next? And this is true also in Frida Kahlo's own house, the Casa Azul, which, as many of you know, is now a museum in Mexico City, her family home. It too was much modified from a sort of basically a Victorian residence that she grew up in into a space for the display of folk art, high art, her own art, Diego Rivera's art, even some European modernism that they owned. And there's just many parallels between what the things that we find at Fallingwater and what we see either in either of the houses of Rivera and Kahlo. And one example would be the ex votos, these small religious paintings on tin, generally, that are painted in commemoration of one's salvation by God from an illness or mishap or accident, tragedy of some type. And they're very few objects, and they're placed kind of individually in different places, as you can see here. And they've moved around in the house over the years. Very different from this massive display of the ex votos that we see in Kahlo's house. But you just find this resonance of the same sorts of objects in the two places. I also want to point out the sculpture here by Mardonio Magana, and Glenn mentioned him. He was, in fact, more or less untrained, at least academically, but was kind of a multifaceted figure who Rivera and Kahlo particularly embraced. And this is one of the reasons why his sculptures appear at Fallingwater. I'll come back to him in a minute, but this is one of the famous works by Magana that was originally in the Kahlo home. Could I have the next slide? There are precedents beyond Mexico for this insertion of Mexican folk objects or colonial objects into the modern residence. And I think, when Church built Olana the painter Frederick Church built Olana in the 1870s, he certainly saw it as a modern residence for a contemporary artist, even if it's obviously totally anti-modernist in many other ways. This eclectic sort of almost neo-Moorish building in Hudson. And wandering through Olana, which is very much like a Victorian residence packed with all sorts of material. One of the things that's really amazing there are the number of Mexican objects that are distributed all around the house, both sort of high-end colonial paintings that Church acquired in the late 19th century. Well after Olana was built, Church began to travel to Mexico in the winter, primarily for health reasons. He didn't do a lot of painting there, but he did collect, and he actually commissioned, as you can see here, local folk artists to make objects specifically for Olana, like this sort of covered tinaco, or this sort of covered pot from Jalisco State, probably from Tonalá, which is inlaid with mother of pearl. We have the next. And another U.S. project, but in Mexico, would be the home of Dwight and Elizabeth Cutter Morrow in Cuernavaca, a vacation residence that they began working on in 1928, around the time that Morrow was named U.S. ambassador to Mexico. And this very much like Olana and like the Kahlo and Rivera residences in Mexico City, this was, a private home, but that did have a public function in that the discourses in these places were meant not only for the family, but were really meant for visitors, and often very high-profile visitors. Could be clients in the case of an artist, could be politicians, or others, say in the case of Morrow. So he was ambassador to Mexico from 1927 to 30, and this was their country house, basically. It was designed by a local vernacular architect in a very much of a kind of a neo-colonial style, with very much of an anti-modernist residence, but filled with Mexican folk art, both contemporary and also historic, of the very highest caliber. And the objects that the Morrows collected were really purchased. They really were just trying to get the best possible examples of ceramics, lacquerwares, wooden furniture, and other things, all of which is now in the collection of the Mead Art Museum at Amherst College, along with a vast archive of related material. And we did a show at Amherst now over more than 20 years ago, maybe 25 years ago, called Casa Mañana, about this house and the collections. So it's a sort of a precedent. If people are interested in the ways that Mexican objects serve in this history of interior decoration, whether of modernist or anti-modernist residences, both Olana and Casa Mañana represent sort of prototypes as part of a history that's yet to be told, I think. And I think one thing I didn't go into in so much detail in the essay was the way that what's really interesting about Fallingwater is that it is part of this broader history of the incorporation of Mexican crafts, folk painting, 19th century, 20th century art into the modern residence, whatever the architecture is. Could I have the next slide? So I just couldn't resist. You know, if you go to Mexico, you buy crafts, and then somebody photographs you buying the crafts. And so on the left is Moro in Oaxaca, buying ceramics, and then a sort of a snapshot of Lilian in Oaxaca in 1938. And if one looks really closely, this photograph wasn't identified in any specific way, but if one looks really closely, you can see that she has all of these ceramics piled up in her arms, and things that she's just bought for perhaps almost nothing. And curiously enough, the reason that we know it is actually Oaxaca is not only the ceramics, which are maybe a little hard to identify, but this benches in the plaza identify this as the main plaza in Oaxaca. They had their first trip to Mexico, the senior and Lilian made their first trip in May 1938. And then Junior joined them, and he returned very frequently. He was back in Mexico in 1939, and then again in 40, and again in 41. And we were really lucky to have access, of course, to all these archival materials, and Scott in particular really appreciate the way that you facilitated a lot of long distance research. I wrote the essay from Mexico, but the letters, particularly that Junior wrote back to his parents during these other trips, provided a lot of insight, I think, to frame what they were doing. He wrote in one letter, it's really, Mexico, it's really the most wonderful place I know. And this deep bond, particularly of Junior to Mexico, is, I think, certainly probably more important than even his parents' interest in Mexico. He forged on these trips a network of connections, particularly in Mexico City. He traveled in different places in Mexico, obviously, but focus on Mexico City. He lived there for a while, rented an apartment in Mexico City for a while. And he was very close not only to Frida and Diego, but to the architect Juan O'Gorman, and was interested in O'Gorman not only as an architect, but as a painter. The Kaufmann family will later try to commission a series of murals from Juan O'Gorman for Jewish Community Center in Pittsburgh. That O'Gorman proposes works that are so overtly anti-fascist and anti-capitalist that the Kaufmann's patronage reaches a little bit of its limit, and those murals are never completed. But and another person that Edgar Jr. is traveling with a lot in Mexico is the MoMA curator John McAndrew, who was in Mexico in 39-40 working on an exhibition for the Museum of Modern Art, 20 Centuries of Mexican Art, which, like the objects in the Kaufmann House, included pre-Columbian and folk and 19th century and 20th century. And it was a sort of a combination of all of those layers of Mexican cultural history at MoMA that I think also influenced a little bit. McAndrew, his collecting interest would have influenced Junior as he was traveling around the country. And McAndrew just has a place in my heart because I'm talking to you from Wellesley College, where he was the great professor of modern art here for many years and the director of our college museum. Next. So one of the interesting things I did not know about was a show a sort of a sales exhibition that the Kaufmann department store put on in November 1940 called Below the Rio Grande. And could have been my title of my show, South of the Border. It could have been called Below the Rio Grande just as much. Which is a fairly well documented project that was, a sales pitch, in which the department store recreated interiors, mainly consisting of Mexican furniture and decorative objects, some textiles, mostly antique, but some contemporary, that had been acquired on buying trips to Mexico. And in his letters, Junior writes specifically about this buying expeditions. He wrote in one letter, talking about being in Mexico City, on the junk shops, I am now fairly expert. Other than old glass, one has to dig hard and patiently. But there is wonderful old furniture, fabrics, painted trays, and Victoriana to be had cheap, and wonderful paintings, decoratively, not artistically. So I think by those wonderful paintings, he's really talking about 19th century art that is kind of folk rather than very sophisticated. He wrote that in a letter home in 1940. So these things were all shown on the 8th floor of the department store at the end of 1940, right before the Christmas season. And it was obviously, could I have the next, here's another installation shot, very much creating a domestic environment so that you could not only perhaps purchase individual objects, but you could get a sense of how to combine those objects back home. And you can see that they were, at least in the store, catering to far more conservative tastes of their buyers, in that these are sort of much more associated with an early American look than with a modernist look. They were not the first to do this. Macy's had done something very similar in 1937. So I think they were modeling themselves on what some of the New York department stores had been doing already in terms of bringing in Mexican crafts, painting, and other objects. But I want to point out that some of the things that were in this in the department store that did not sell ended up in Fallingwater. And I think many of the other things must be still in Pittsburgh. Well, many of them must be still in Pittsburgh homes. You know, somebody needs to poke around Pittsburgh more to see if they can find some of this Mexican Chippendale furniture and 18th and 19th century paintings. But such as this urn, this blue and white urn that you see in the photograph on the right, which is now sitting on a desk, that is from Puebla, produced in the 18th century. So this is a sort of was always a high-end object, would have been a rather expensive object even in the 1930s, 40s. And this is a time when the Met and Art Institute of Chicago are collecting this Talavera, Mexican Talavera from Puebla. And so there's 2 or 3 excellent examples of it in Fallingwater today. Can I have the next? The painting there in the center above the table is also at Fallingwater at the top of a stairway, and you can see it on the right side. This is actually a sort of exception. The provenance of this painting is, as many of the things that were exhibited in this show, is, you know, unknown. I mean, where Junior was buying them and whether this painting had somehow made its way to Mexico or not is unclear, but it is not, in fact, a Mexican painting. It's a image of Our Lady of Mercy, or sometimes it's called the Pilgrim of Quito, was painted in either Peru or Ecuador in the 18th century. So there are these kind of non-Mexican things that made their way into a show, and it's very unclear to me. In fact, I wasn't able to figure out whether anybody really knew that it was not a Mexican painting at the time. Could I have the next? Another part of the show at the department store did create a much more modernist environment. You can see that the walls are left quite plain, and there's a coffee table surrounded by modernist furniture, most of it by the Mexico City firm Domus, which was a kind of a collaborative project of this guy, Michael Van Buren, who had studied at the Bauhaus, an American who had studied at the Bauhaus, then afterwards ended up in Mexico, where he became one of the real leaders of introducing modernist, particularly kind of Danish modern style furniture to Mexico on a commercial level. But he also worked with this guy, Klaus Grave and Morley Webb. And this webbed furniture there on either side of the coffee table is by them. Oh, I think I goofed. Sorry, I just jumped ahead a little bit. I'll get back to the furniture. I just wanted to say that the landscape on the back of the room is at Fallingwater today, and it is signed by the Mexican landscape artist Jose Maria Velasco and dated 1877. And when I first went through the house, I thought it was a Velasco, and then Ed Jr. actually in a recorded tour of Fallingwater, and I can't remember the date. Scott might remember the date of that recorded tour, but much later, he says to the group, he says as he's going through the house, well, we have this painting that people thought was a Velasco, but we know it's not a Velasco. So he somehow figured out that in fact this painting was not a Velasco, but fortunately I had some colleagues in Mexico who knew exactly what it was by this student of Velasco named Adolfo Tenorio. So we now know exactly what this painting was, although I think in the period, at least when it was purchased, it would have been thought to be a work by Velasco, and somebody actually signed it probably to pawn it off as a Velasco to unknowing American buyers. Could I have the next? Now I really wanted to talk about the importance of these chairs. This is a very early documentation of this furniture in the United States. These chairs had been, a lounge chair by Domus had been featured at the MoMA's Organic Design and Home Furnishing Show of 1941. But this is an earlier promotion of this particular modernist Mexican furniture in the United States. And this furniture had a big impact in Mexico, so I couldn't resist showing the great photographer Manuel Alvarez Bravo sitting in a similar chair by Domus in a photograph from the same period. There is just one lounge chair in not perfect condition at Fallingwater today. It's in storage, not on display. Could I have the next? And of course, one of the delightful things are not only the works by Diego Rivera at Fallingwater, but really interestingly, the works by Mardonio Magana. He was actually sort of what we call in Mexico the portero, the doorman for a school, a federal school that taught young people and some working class people direct carving, sculpture in downtown Mexico City. He was one of these sort of 19th, 20th century types who, I think he sold ice cream too and had other jobs besides being a doorman. And he watched the students work, heard about the teachers talking to the students about direct carving in wood and stone, and he began making his own sculptures and really was picked up by Diego Rivera around 1930 as a perfect embodiment of the quintessential untrained Mexican artist, a mestizo, a working class guy whose talent was deeply innate and such that great objects just almost emerged, and Rivera promoted him, collected his work, and here on the right side you can see Kahlo and Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo at the Kahlo house in Coyoacan with all of these Magañas distributed in the garden. And this certainly is a model for the Kaufmanns, who would have seen this well before they commissioned sculptures by Magana in 1941. So they really were placing these now in a much more, not so much in the display of quantity that you see at the Casa Azul, but more as, and as Glenn said, these sort of linchpins or placed at key points. They've not weathered, they're now protected in the winter. There's a big advantage to showing these in where it doesn't snow. outdoors, but they remain in really beautiful condition today. And I think they're one of the most extraordinary things at Fallingwater from a Mexicanist's perspective. He's anyway, there they are. And one of the things that I wanted to say about all of this stuff, the retablos, the 19th century paintings, the works by Diego Rivera, the folk art that we find all throughout the house, is that almost all of those things are really the products of the working class. And they emphasize the working class either as the subject of the artwork, as is the case in Rivera and Magana, or are the makers of the works of art. And I think this really has to do with the way that the Kaufmanns are connecting to a broader history that I explored in South of the Border, which is the idea of Mexico as anti-modern and Mexico as folk and Mexico as handmade. The wood surfaces, the stone surfaces really resonate with the materials of Fallingwater, but they really are about the anti-urban, even if they are sort of modern. The final thing I have is a coda. Could I have the last slide? Is one of the most fun parts of my research was kind of exploring the Kaufmann's patronage of Frida Kahlo. And you won't find any works by Frida Kahlo at Fallingwater today, unfortunately. I think you'd probably get even more visitors did you have them, but Edgar Kaufmann Jr. bought two paintings the Kaufmann family acquired two paintings by Kahlo from the surrealist art dealer Julian Levy, who showed Kahlo's work in 1938. And from that show, they acquired both My Birth of 1932, there in the center, and Remembrance of an Open Wound. The Remembrance of an Open Wound sadly was destroyed in a fire at Junior's Garrison, New York house in 1983. A tremendous loss, both financial and for art history. And My Birth was sold by Kaufmann to Madonna in 1987. He actually kept My Birth in his New York apartment, and he put it in a little closet and would show it to visitors by opening the door that they could peek in. Kaufmann Jr. also provided the funds for MoMA to buy the great and famous self-portrait with cropped hair. So their patronage at Fallingwater, we see, Magana, Rivera, and as well as the folk objects, many of which came out of the department store show. But their patronage of Mexican art went beyond Fallingwater, both in the case of Kahlo and in the case of Juan O'Gorman, whose murals, as I said, for that Jewish Community Center in Pittsburgh were never realized. So those are just a few of the things I wanted to talk about, and I look forward to any questions, and I'll turn it over to the next speaker. Thank you all.
James, thank you so much for that talk. The Mexican pieces in our collection are certainly some of the most interesting and compelling for me, so I really, really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you. We'll move on to Jeannine Falino on American craft. But Jeannine is an independent curator and museum consultant working in craft, design, and American culture. Her wide-ranging projects have explored virtually every age of American art from the colonial era onward. Formerly curator of American decorative arts at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, she now develops exhibitions, catalogs, and books for museums, art organizations, and collectors. Select exhibitions that Jeannine organized include New York Silver, Then and Now, a dialogue between contemporary artists and the historic silver collection of the Museum of the City of New York, the major survey exhibition Crafting Modernism, Mid-Century American Art and Design, and What Would Mrs. Webb Do? A Founder's Vision, an exhibition on the role of advocacy and philanthropy in American craft, both at the Museum of Arts and Design. She served as a curatorial consultant for Parallels, a history of women in design at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. And Jeannine teaches the history of adornment at RISD and American craft and history of American ceramics at Parsons, the New School. And she's currently writing a biography on the work of American jeweler John Paul Miller. Jeannine, we look forward to hearing about your discoveries here at Fallingwater.
Thank you very much. Scott and Justin. I have to say it was an enormous pleasure to work with you and to really examine Fallingwater from an inside-out perspective. We were given full access to all the materials that were available at Fallingwater, and you all went far and above any expectations and really gave us as much as possible that we needed to produce our work. And so it was a really fruitful and enjoyable experience. And so what I'm going to speak to you all about today is the many objects, the American objects, both crafted and designed, that are at Fallingwater. And this part of the story doesn't have the kind of sustained resonance as we just heard from James, where there was an abiding interest and there were purchases that seemed to be consistent with activities at the store and travel and so forth. But rather, these are the more casual accumulations that of objects that came and went and have had, reflect changing interests on the part of the Kaufmanns and of Junior. So let's start with the first slide. And we'll see this really rare and wonderful photograph on the right of the main living space inside of the hangover, circa 1920s. And this doesn't look anything like Fallingwater, but in some ways it does, and that's why it makes a great starting point. The house was actually a prefabricated cabin that was produced in Michigan, and it was placed on this property where Bear Run was some 1,000 acres at the time. And it came along just after the Kaufmanns had been building a little building for some of their staff to get time off during the summers. And so this was an unobtrusive little cabin, and it was called the Hangover for reasons you might come up with, that it was perched over a hill, but I imagine there was lots of levity in the evening, so mornings might have been a little dull around the house. So it was an unpretentious start, and that was the entire point for the family. They had a great house in Pittsburgh called La Tourelle, and I think we saw a picture of it in James's lecture. And La Tourelle was very formal, was intended to receive guests, was intended to receive people of their class, and lots of brown stuff, as we decorative arts people will say, lots of formality. And the Hangover, by comparison, is very relaxed. There's a rough rug on the floor. There are some very simple cabin type chairs. There's a gigantic spinning wheel, and some of these things may have been found in their jaunts around the Pittsburgh, or the Fallingwater, I should say, countryside. And they came about in small, different ways, random ways, I would say. Behind the spinning wheel is difficult to see, but there is a stump, and that is a chestnut stump, one of at least two that the family had, because there had been a blight of chestnut wood, and these were the remains of a few trees that had been chopped down. They began to serve as casual coffee tables and such. So really unpretentious in that respect. And so they can be seen here on the left on the steps of the Hangover. I mean, people sitting on the steps or stoop. This is a very casual kind of way to be seen. If they were in Pittsburgh, they would have been in a more formal setting, standing up, wearing suits and dresses and looking much more formal. But here they could let their hair down, they could be themselves, and they could be alone together. Now, the paradox for Fallingwater is that it is this grand historic house of great international importance. We all are agreed on that. And they certainly understood that as well. They paid a fortune for the house. It was featured internationally. Everybody knew about it and the fame, but yet they chose to live in their house in a much more relaxed fashion. And so that's what we'll look at today. The other part before we continue is that because the Kaufmanns were Jewish, they were part of Pittsburgh society, and indeed they were prominent members along with the Heinzes and the Mellons and such. But there was always a little bit of a barrier that prevented them from fully integrating. This was a social barrier of the time. And so this was a place they could really be fully themselves. They didn't have to be anybody but themselves. And I think that's a very powerful, important way of a lens to look at their collection. All right, let's continue. So the Kaufmanns assembled quite an eclectic collection of objects, and these are simply two of them. On the right is this salt glazed stoneware with lovely cobalt decoration that came right out of the region where Fallingwater was. There were a lot of stoneware makers along the Erie Canal extension where they were. Companies that were located in Morgantown and nearby, and it was very easy for them to have picked these up in their jaunts in the countryside. And there's quite a large collection of them. And whether they started collecting them at the Hangover or whether they began once they moved into Fallingwater isn't entirely clear. But the fact is you can find them at various juncture points and also in a larger assemblage. Now for the Kaufmanns, Kaufmann Sr., these pieces had extra significance because there was a story, and I think largely true, that George Washington had been in the area during the Revolutionary War, and it was his fervent hope that he could prove that Washington owned the property he had purchased. That didn't quite bear out, but nevertheless, the first things they really began to collect, it seems, were crocks like these and Audubon prints. We know the Audubon prints were in the Hangover, and they migrated over. So this is really represents the age of Americana collecting that was so prevalent during this period. On the left is a Zuni Oya, a water vessel, and a really magnificent one at that. You'll find great examples of these in all the important museums. It's quite a catch. And it represents one of perhaps a dozen or more objects of Native American art, including basketry from the Northwest coast. And you've seen this already in one of the pictures we saw earlier, but it was placed on one of these wonderful, long, shallow shelves that line Fallingwater wherever you look. And as I like to say, the objects are like notes, clef notes on a musical score, where you see these little points of interesting, fascinating color and pattern. And so in bringing these pieces together and more into the house, they began this process of what has been called humanizing modernism that has been spoken about and relates to the house, for instance, that the Eameses owned. This very simple house, which was really just a lot of rectangles and put together with hardware easily available, soon became filled with beautiful pieces that Ray Eames largely assembled and humanized that interior from that very rectilinear space, or that Corbusier space, as we heard from Glenn, into this warm interior. So that is the story here, this eclectic kind of assemblage, and their appearance in this horizontal horizon that Wright felt was so important. In terms of quality, I would say that, you know, these are two very fine pieces, but there are others that are perhaps lesser. And it was not the point for collecting great art. The family were collecting great objects of Western art. The pieces they brought here were really those that made them feel good, made them feel comfortable, reminded them of their travels, and really, you know, created memory for the family, because most of these things could really not easily be shown in La Tourelle. Let's go on to the next one. One object that did migrate from La Tourelle is this wonderful fire iron, also known as the Devil's Pitchfork, and it's the sole surviving piece from the original house that we know of that was produced by Samuel Yellen. Now, Yellen had done an enormous amount of work for the family at their Pittsburgh home, and in fact, he installed a forge on their property while he worked on all of the fixtures for the home. So there was a great relationship of patronage between the Kaufmanns and Yellen. And so this was, we believe, a gift from him to the couple. And this curious element of this devil with a giant horn on his head is related to his own personal history, because Yellen was known as a devil with a hammer. And we speculate that perhaps this is his, as a parting gift, is to remember their devil with a hammer who had done so much work for them. And as you can see, it's very prominently arranged on the fireplace on a shallow shelf that is really just part of the projecting masonry. And it's next to this low bowl that we'll talk about in a moment, which is used here for matches. Let's continue. Now, aside from what the Kaufmann parents collected, Edgar Kaufmann was, of course, immensely, well, he was a protean figure, as I'm sure you all know. He was a student of Frank Lloyd Wright. He actually introduced them to his parents, and so it can be credited with the origins of the seed of Fallingwater. And he joined MoMA in 1938. By 1946, he was head of industrial design there. And he had a huge amount of influence over the sorts of things that were shown. And at this period, he was also ensconced in an apartment in Manhattan. And there are some surviving photographs of that apartment, which demonstrate that he was he was collecting as widely as his parents in terms of art, international art. He owned works in this apartment by Alvaro Aalto, Juan Miró, Jackson Pollock, even Henry Moore. And so in this apartment were also more humble pieces. And one of them is here on the right, and it is today in Fallingwater. And this is an elongated favrile vase that you can see in the photograph at the left, the taller one. But of the trio on the left there, it's clear that that is another Tiffany vase. So Kaufmann was looking at all of these industrial design objects for his shows, the Good Design series, his pots and pans exhibitions, where industry was really the central focus. And yet he demonstrated as early as 1950 that he had this abiding, perhaps curiosity, or he was simply attracted by its beauty, brought them into his house and shared its space with all these other wonderful objects that he owned. He was not really interested in the hand at first, as you can imagine. He did not valorize the hand. He had written pieces that criticized Morris and Ruskin, seeing them as really retarded tear. And yet I think over time, as just the objects help to tell us that that position began to change. You know, he was an advocate of Frank Lloyd Wright's manifesto about the art and craft of the machine and how the machine could do as much as any other object and can be used in conjunction with the hand. But little by little, there seems to have been a change of heart. And over time, he softened in his attitude. So let's have a look at the next one. So here is the little match holder that we saw with the pitchfork. And it's a gorgeous piece. And we can see that it also appears as the base of a lamp. And this tells us that this object began its life as a lamp base, and it probably lost its shade as Tiffany fell way out of favor in the 30s after Tiffany's death, and that's Louis Comfort Tiffany. His work went into a deep, deep dive, and it was only until the 50s that his reputation began to return. And in fact, he had a show at the Museum of Arts and Design, then called the Museum of Contemporary Craft in New York around 1959. But pieces like this were not acquired by the elder Kaufmanns. This was a purchase by Junior himself. And it proves the point that he was disinterested in the absolute perfect thing. He was interested in the beauty that these pieces showed. And perhaps at the time he hadn't found really fine examples of them. In time he did. He actually gave several pieces to MoMA, and he lent pieces to the Museum of Art and Designs to show on Tiffany. So he was, at this point, really just glad to find these unusual examples. And regardless of whether they were complete or a part that he happened to love, he gave them the same kind of regard. Next slide. But of course, his industrial interests, which kind of dovetailed with his retail experience with his parents, were a part of this as well. And so the item I'd like you to look at on the left is this ice bucket, which is probably one of the most interesting pieces in the show, in the book to me and in the house, because it is a real hybrid object. Now, Russell Wright was a very well-known designer, and I think I've forgotten, that's the correct spelling of his name. But the desire to also match with the house in certain ways is also evident here. So this ice bucket began life as an aluminum bucket with no decoration, except it had a handle in the center. The handle is gone. The body has received a coat of paint. And I love this because seated as it is on that chestnut stump that we discussed earlier and that made it into the house is also featured directly behind this marvelous spherical urn that Wright designed that sits next to the fireplace. And the objects were placed with real care in the house. And I feel fairly certain that, given the pictures we've seen historically, that this piece is intended to echo the water urn. And it was modified to suit its new location. So it received a coat of paint, and the lid received some kind of gold wash. And the handle, which maybe have seemed too modern, was removed, so it could exist in this region of sort of quiet relationship with the larger vessel. You know, on the other hand, other more industrially designed works did make it in, and in particular, I point you to the water pitcher of 1939 that was produced by American bottle company. And this was it's a beautiful spherical form. It has this chrome surface on the upper portion, and it's a really great example of modern design in its real absence of decoration, just with the handle and the spout. And as if I'm not mistaken, the cup is from the glass is from Finland, and this is a sort of a mechanized production of glass that was produced in Finland. But these sat by the bed. They did not necessarily fit in with the wood and the rough-hewn walls of the interior, but they were also mindful additions and no doubt extensions of Kaufmann's own personal interest in these objects, professionally as well as personally. Continue. The other marvelous piece in here of design is this BKF, or butterfly chair, that was designed by a Spanish and Argentinian trio of designers, Bonet, Kirschan, and Ferrari Hardoy. And this is probably the first piece of its type to have entered the United States. And it was purchased by Kaufmann. And it is, as you can see, it's slung with leather as it originally was. And in typical fashion, he also gave one or two of them to MoMA. So it's also interesting to think of the house as a kind of laboratory for his interests in enlarging the collection at MoMA, positioning them in the house to see how they would appear, and really, considering how these new objects are really adaptable to modern life. There's also, I'll just point out here on the right, there is a portrait head that is a little difficult to see, but it's to the left of the flower vase, and that is by Roland Barthes. And I believe the subject is actually the young Edgar himself, Jr. And we'll see a little bit more of this in a moment. Let's continue. So these two vessels, one of which was mentioned by Glenn, are really wonderful examples of the unostentatious beauty that Edgar Jr. came to embrace. He was very interested in harmony and earth-based things as time went on. And he acquired this example on the left from the Knotzlers, a really beautifully potted vase. The couple were a pair in their fabrications. Gertrude was the potter and Otto was the glaze master. And they were both refugees from Austria, having left just after Kristallnacht. And they appeared in some of his exhibitions, like Useful Goods. And in the process, as was his wont, he purchased examples for himself, and he also purchased 7 bowls for MoMA. And again, that proves the concept of this laboratory setting where he was placing them in his home to see how they fit. And perhaps as a curator, and I can certainly sympathize with this, he just wanted some for himself. It happens that many of Junior's shows began to include more and more craft people. And they include artists like Edith Heath, who worked in Sausalito in the Bay Area. And on one trip they took together, they were jurying a show and they were driving together, and he turned to her and said, your work is going to last generations. You are really standing at the top of the field, and your work is great, great design. But it was also partly handmade. Same is true for Art Carpenter, the furniture maker, who also produced a lot of small objects in addition to his larger furniture, and so were easily replicated and were attractive for the MoMA shows. And Lenore Tawney, the piece on the right by Carlton Ball appeared in, or one like it, I should say, appeared in 100 Useful Objects. And Carlton Ball is still not a very well-known maker. He was a potter. He worked in California at a number of sites. He traveled to Wisconsin and other locations. He was also very interested in silversmithing, and he took part in the Handy and Harmon silver conferences that were held in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And we don't know exactly how Ball and Junior met, but clearly he was taken with this bowl, and it can be seen in historic photographs of the house where it served as a place to put flowers, like with a frog in the center where you could place flowers. So it had many homes in the house and was endlessly useful. And in an article that he wrote about Ball's work, he called them the kind of work he made was pure and serene, forms that grow out of the steady rotation of the potter's wheel. This doesn't sound like a man who has a manifesto with Frank Lloyd Wright and is talking all about the machine. It's a man who's really been converted to the beauty of craft and particularly to pottery. Let's continue. So Peter Volkos was also in the Good Design Show of 1954, and that is probably how the two men met. And of course, Volkos is known for having really destroyed the vessel in its traditional form and created it was a paradigm shift in the way that he upended all the notions of what the vessel could do, and by piercing it, by tearing it, by turning it. And so we don't know what exactly was shown in the exhibition, but clearly the two men got along. And not long after the exhibition, actually just a year later, he commissioned this piece called Funiculated Smog. And today it sits at this beautiful pool in a lovely place where it has a pride of place. But it is completely non-functional. And it is a really radical departure for him for Kaufmann, I should say, from anything else that he really collected. And it shows to me the amount of change that he had gone through in his own personal aesthetic to move from the machine to the hand to abstraction and sculpture. So, and it's a marvelous piece. It looks great from every angle. And I'd like to conclude with one piece that is by Roland Barthes, who we just talked about briefly, who produced the head of Edgar. Barthes, his reputation is really rising again. He was essentially forgotten for quite a long while, in my opinion. But Barthes had a very early start in Mississippi. He showed early promise, and friends arranged for him to get to Chicago, where he studied at the Art Institute. He produced a lot of portrait heads, and I think they formed a certain amount of his bread and butter or his relationship building with potential patrons. And so he, in the end, he was very successful. And by 1930, he decided to move to New York. And he lived in Greenwich Village, and he became part of the life of the artists and dancers and actors that he knew. He went to Harlem. He did live in Harlem for a time as well. And it seems that he was a large part of the theater and art crowd in that area at that time. And it's not clear exactly how he met Junior. That part is unclear, but what is certain is that they met and they found a real connection, one to the other. Junior had been trying to be an artist and really felt that he was not going to make it. And I can say, as an art historian, uh, I much prefer being an art historian to an artist because of the challenges and what I think maybe we know we know too much about what good art should look like. But he found in Barthet a really great artist whose work he could support. And so in 1940, he commissioned this work called Serena, which is in cast concrete and can be seen outdoors. Serena, the figure who is being represented here, is Rose McLandon. And she was a very well-known actress in her day. She appeared in the first Porgy and Bess of 1927. She was also the founder of the Negro People's Theater Club. And she is playing here Serena in Porgy. And it's this moment where she is hearing about her husband's death. And she is in the newspapers reporting of her. She was clasping her hands and standing in a tall column. And no doubt Barthet had seen her in this as well. Unfortunately, she died young. She died in 1936. And so this work appears to be an homage to her. And we don't know whether it was commissioned by Junior or not, but it stands here as a real testament to that. And in fact, Fallingwater has one of the larger collections of Barthet sculptures, and more people should come and see that. So, you know, in thinking about the variety of things that you've seen here, the overriding factor is this unpretentious approach, this kind of relaxed elegance, as we sometimes call it, but that make it a real place of home. While the house is iconic and lasting, you know, will last the test of time, the objects in many cases are reflective of the personal passions of the artists that Junior got to know, and provide a memory of those things, and provide a comfort when one is in one's own house. And in many respects, it's quite similar to the lives we all live in our own homes. And I'd like to think that that's what links us to him. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeannine. I think relaxed elegance is a perfect way to explain the feeling of Fallingwater. And I also appreciated your telling of Junior's coming around to craft. So that was wonderful. Thank you very much. And we'll end with Dave Bryce, and it's his photography that sort of brings all of these compelling stories together in a beautifully visual way. Dave has earned a reputation for capturing the beauty and essence of a space through his work. His passionate study of space and light is evident and fuels the exploration of depth and dimension in his photographs. Armed with a keen eye for detail and a patient, calm approach, time is his essential ally in creating photographs that not only beautiful, but tell a story. Emotion and atmosphere, a sense of being, emerge from the detail, form, and texture of the spaces he documents. Dave has worked with some of the most talented American architects and designers working today and has been published in numerous publications and books. And in addition to his work as an architectural and interiors photographer, Dave is also a commercial and editorial food photographer, where his technical mastery and keen sense of partnership with chefs and stylists allows him to create visually appealing and appetizing images. His unique perspective, technical skills, and attention to detail make Dave one of the most sought-after lenses in the industry, and we were very lucky to have him be the eye for this project. So Dave, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, well, thank you so much, Justin, and hi, everybody. Thank you for attending. So taking a picture is easy, right? Almost anyone can do it. You grab a camera, you pull out your phone, you point and you click. It's second nature in our world of instant snapshots. But capturing a unique, awe-inspiring image, one that stops a viewer mid-scroll or keeps them from flipping the page, creating an image that fills you with emotions or inspires you is not an easy task. Creating a photograph that stirs emotions, especially of an iconic place like Fallingwater, comes with its own set of challenges. It's not about snapping a picture that's been taken hundreds, if not thousands of times. It's about seeing what others overlook, feeling the moment, and translating that into something lasting. Fallingwater, with its seamless blend of architecture and nature, doesn't give up its secrets easily. Every situation and subject brings unique photographic hurdles. A crowded tourist spot might mean waiting for a clear shot. A cloudy day might hide the light you need. Over the years, I've learned that photographing Fallingwater is as much about preparation and persistence as it is about creativity. Today, I'd like to share a part of my recipe for capturing this remarkable place. These ingredients have guided me through countless photo shoots. Patience. Patience is the silent backbone of creativity, a quiet guide that's easy to underestimate. Be still, sit, and observe. Absorb your surroundings, the rustle of leaves, the damp scent of moss, the play of light and shadow across the stones, your own feelings and thoughts as you settle into the space. It's about grounding yourself in the moment before you ever lift the camera. Let time pass without rushing to snap shots. Patience isn't just waiting. It's trusting the process, believing that the right moment will come if you give it space to unfold. I've spent hours at Fallingwater doing just that, sitting on a rock by the stream, listening to the waterfall, letting the rhythm of the place sink in. It's meditative and it shifts how you see your surroundings. It's about noticing details and resisting the urge to rush. The way the shadow creeps across the wall as the sun moves, or the faint mist that lingers after a rain. It takes time, practice, and discipline, qualities that don't come naturally in a world that's obsessed with speed. But at Fallingwater, rushing gets you nowhere. Patience means waiting, sometimes minutes, sometimes hours, or even days, for the sun rays to streak through the trees or the fog to roll through the valley, or for the weather to shift in your favor. It's what stops you from settling for okay and drives you towards wow, a truly inspiring image that captures the soul of the place. Early in my Fallingwater journey, I became obsessed with this composition. I love the lines and the points of interest and how it gives a view outside the guest house. I believe this is the wrong image. There it is. After a few test shots from the ground level, I came to realize that I needed to be elevated much higher. And by placing the camera on the wall along the walkway, I was able to get far enough back and elevated enough from the scene to capture all the elements that I wanted to. Another key ingredient in my creative recipe is anticipation. It's like a radar for creativity, a muscle that strengthens with use, becoming a reliable tool over time. It's not guesswork. It's calculated and honed by experience and attention. Anticipation sharpens your focus, letting you craft a strong composition before the moment arrives. It's about knowing your subject, how light falls on it, how weather changes it, and planning accordingly. At Fallingwater, that might mean predicting how the morning sun will hit the cantilevered terraces or how the interior of the house will interact with the light. From the day I started photographing Fallingwater, I dreamed of capturing it after a heavy snowfall. I waited for over a year for the chance, checking forecasts, picturing snow-laden trees framing the house. Next slide. One winter afternoon, the forecast shifted abruptly, from a slight chance of snow to warnings of up to 8 inches overnight. The storm was set to begin around midnight, and so I sprang into action. I contacted the security team to let them know that I'd arrive before sunrise, and driving in a snowstorm wasn't an ideal option, and not wanting to be a bother at last minute, I decided to head out that night. I packed my cold weather hiking gear, including my sub-zero sleeping bag, and drove to a parking lot up the road from Fallingwater. I arrived just before midnight, bundled up in layers, and slept in my SUV. When my alarm went off at 5 a.m., over 6 inches of fresh snow blanketed the ground. The world was silent and pristine. Anticipating that snowy weather led to images I'd dreamed of for a long time. By tracking details like the weather, time of day, or the sun's path, you can anticipate what's coming. It's a dance between planning and waiting, and Fallingwater rewards those who master it. Patience and anticipation work together. When you predict how the sun's rays will streak through the trees or a window at a certain moment, you wait for it to happen. I spent afternoons in the living room watching the light creep across the walls, knowing that at a certain time it would hit just right. And then I'd wait, camera ready for the exact moment. But sometimes you can't predict what's next, and that's when emotions take over and guide you. These moments strike fast and unexpectedly, and when they do, you drop everything and seize them before they slip away. One unforgettable moment came during a torrential downpour while photographing the exterior. Rain was expected in the forecast, so I was ready, but not for its intensity. While shooting the plunge pool and stairs, a light drizzle turned into an intense downpour. Sheets of rain fell from the sky, forcing me to quickly take cover under the bridge. As I dried my gear and cursed the weather forecast, I noticed how the rain flowed over the mother and child sculpture at the pool's edge, streaming down and dripping off in rhythmic drops. It was mesmerizing. Nature and art blending together. I abandoned all other thoughts and focused on finding a composition. And that moment, wet, chaotic, and alive, became a very powerful image. And I'm grateful that I was there to witness it. The final ingredient is perspective. Perspective is a powerful tool. It shapes how viewers see a scene and how I tell the story of my subject. Finding unique perspectives isn't easy. I almost never just set up a camera and shoot. Instead, I move around the subject, exploring it from all sides, 360 degrees if possible. I'll crouch low, climb high, step back, lean in, anything to see it anew. I'll walk around it until it's out of sight or can't go any further, and then circle it in from a distance, slowly closing in. This reveals angles I'd missed if I'd settled too soon. And at Fallingwater, that might mean spotting how the house nestles into the hillside from afar or how the trees frame it from a distance. And when I can, I take to the air. Using a drone, helicopter, or plane opens up striking perspectives. From above, Fallingwater's geometry comes alive. Cantilevers jutting over the water, rooftops blending with treetops. These aerial shots show a side of Fallingwater most never get to see. Exploring perspectives also uncovers abstract and detailed shots. Fallingwater's lines and shapes grab your attention. They're everywhere you look. The sharp edge of the staircase, the curve of the walkway, and the grid of the window panes against the stone. I've spent hours chasing these details, finding compositions within compositions. Many images in this book come from an in situ perspective, placing the camera where life happens. For example, setting it low on the floor in the living room mimics sitting low in the chairs and sofa. Most people walk through snapping photos from eye level and miss this lived-in view. The way the furniture frames the fireplace, or the view stretches out to the trees. It's intimate, like you're part of the space. The art collection inside and around Fallingwater is extraordinary. Sculptures, paintings, furnishings. Each piece deepens the harmony of architecture and nature that makes this place so special. It's not just a house, it's a living gallery. A conversation between human craft and the wild world around it. When you visit Fallingwater, take your time, move slowly, pause, and soak in every moment. Explore it from different angles, and watch how the light shifts through the day and how the house and the art dance with it. Listen to the water cascading over the falls, the birds calling, the chipmunks chirping, the insects humming. Breathe in the fresh air and savor being surrounded by nature. Fallingwater isn't a place to rush through. It's a place to feel, a place to see, and a place to carry with you. Thanks for attending.
Your images and your presentation were both poetry. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.
I'll turn it over to Scott now for the Q&A.
Yeah, I was going to say we've got a few questions here, but great presentations all around. There was a question about the department store and whether they purchased things to make as replicas in the department store. And I'm not sure that was ever the case, but it is kind of interesting that they did own a department store. So they're coming at it with kind of the eye of a curator or a merchant when they're selecting their objects. And you all kind of touched on the fact of, kind of designed objects versus crafted objects. But Glenn, I was wondering if the department store figures anywhere into this kind of history of modern house interiors.
Oh, absolutely. That's a great question. And I'm thinking, I know Jeannine would have something to say about this as well. The importance of the department store, particularly in America, as a setting for the craft movement. So we could think about a place like Gump's, for example, out in California. Quite a few department stores on the East Coast, including specialist department stores that were presenting Scandinavian material, which was very important as an influence on the craft movement as well. So I don't know so much about Kaufmann's itself and what kind of craft material they might have had out on the floor, but you really can't understand the proliferation of the craft movement in America, particularly, without thinking about the department store as a kind of transmission channel. I suppose earlier on, we might also think about the way that department stores, even Liberty here in London would be a great example of this. The way that department stores not only served as a space where people would be able to encounter advanced design, but also were really ideal situations for a kind of total environment, Gesamtkunstwerk, because of the kind of thematic nature of their displays and the fact that they also worked very quickly in rotating displays. So both in the front windows and also in the interiors, you would have a kind of comprehensive vision that I suppose would have been also in dialogue with other temporary displays like the kinds that you would get at World's Fairs. And that again would be an important part of the craft movement story. Think of the 1939 Golden Gate Exposition, for example, and the way that that really codified a certain kind of emergent California design, as well as Native American art and craft. So there's a whole kind of complex of settings that I think are more important than museums are for really presenting craft and design in a coherent aesthetic manner, and department stores are definitely one of them alongside expositions. It's really not until the 1920s that the museums really start to get involved in that, and it's probably not until the 50s that museums catch up to the influence that department stores have in really saying what is modern design, what does modern craft look like. Would you agree with that, Jeannine? Does that sound about right?
Well, to some extent. I mean, the first two things that came to mind for me was Wanamaker's, which had period rooms, very elaborately developed. I think it was in the early 20s, maybe. They really set rooms for people to think about. If you want to create a room of a certain type, you could walk in and see objects that were perhaps a recent manufacture or crafted, but it would be to certain tastes of different time periods. The other source going back is really the Met. The Met had a series of interiors that they showed. I mean, they first began with exhibitions on reproductions based on historic objects in their collection. And then in time, and it didn't take that long, they realized that they really had all these talented people right around them. And so they went on to have a series of exhibitions that showed interiors by modern designers. And it kind of points to the rise of modern design. At the same time, those objects were often made by craftspeople. They aren't always recognized as such. So, so I think that had also had a strong influence. I also believe that, you know, there are a lot of like model houses. There was some, I can't remember, maybe you will, Glenn, there was some model house, I think near Rockefeller Center in like 1949. And there were, you know, other houses that were being produced like, what is it? What's the aluminum company?
Yeah, Alcoa.
Alcoa. There are all these Alcoa houses that they built around the country. And so those were ways that people could go and see and emulate things for themselves.
The sort of House of Tomorrow model.
House
You know,
of
the other thing
Tomorrow.
that,
Yeah,
of course, we should also mention, this is almost too obvious to mention, but of course, the Kaufmann office, which is in the department store, which has now been beautifully restored and put into the Vienna East storehouse, so people can see it for
right.
the first time. It's only, you
Sure.
know, a mile east of me here, and that's an absolutely incredible, incredibly realized and synthetic space, and it has important craft objects. For example, Loya Saarinen did the carpet for it. So, in addition to Wright's built-in furniture, that's a real masterpiece of integrated craft, and that was in the department store, although it was in the back spaces. It wasn't something the public would see.
It brings up an interesting point, because I made a note here to ask, and either of you three curator types can answer it, but at some point, all of these functional objects become, or change function, become non-functional when they start becoming displayed in a historic house museum. And while we're, you know, the Kaufmanns may or may not have had their ice cream in that Natzler bowl, at some point it stopped with its original function and became kind of a do not touch, do not sort of look object in the house. And I don't know what that means, so I'll let you answer that question. But these functional objects certainly do not become, or do not carry on with the same function that they were designed to hold.
Well, I mean, that's definitely true. I mean, the
Yeah.
people who originally bought Oyas in the Southwest knew that they, or might have known that they were water vessels, but I doubt that they ever filled them.
Fill them with
So
water.
I think when you're buying from craftspeople, I mean, the only piece that I discussed that was truly functional was the Carlton Ball vessel that was often used to hold flowers. But I think when you're choosing certain crafted objects, and certainly for Junior, who was buying things for himself and at MoMA at the same time, I think he had a curator's eye and placed it on a shelf where he could admire it rather than use it.
That sounds fair. I wrote about this a little bit in my book, Fewer Better Things, but one thing I've always been struck by is that particularly museum curators sort of painstakingly don't use objects in the way that they were intended, even down to the fact that you're instructed not to use the handle on a historic object because it could be loosely attached, for example. So we turn things upside down, and we obviously never put things in them. So we're constantly divorcing ourselves from them, even when we do touch them, which is rarely. And that's really quite a modern approach to objects. You know, for example, in historic cabinets of curiosity, those objects would have been taken out and manhandled and woman handled very freely. And it's really only when you get into the creation of the modern museum complex in the 19th century that you start to have that sort of alienated relationship to the object, and it's like the more valuable and highly regarded the object is,
Separation.
the less you treat it according to its original intention. So it's this funny kind of backwards relationship, and that's certainly true in a historic house museum like Fallingwater too.
Yeah. Well, even I was going to also ask James, you know, some of his objects that he discussed were, you know, sort of anonymously made. We don't know anything much about the maker, and there's not a name attached to it, but there might be, you know, markers or identifiers on a ceramic piece that let you know kind of that it was from Oaxaca. But it's harder thing to curate here, I think, for us when we don't know much about the maker behind it, because there is that kind of fascination with the people who, you know, made things.
The irony is that it's sure if you have a Natzler bowl, that's, you know, you could probably not replace the exact glaze, the bowl of the exact glaze. Some of the ceramics, I mean, they develop an aura because actually the irony is that in a house museum or in a museum collection, objects that had really no value originally, I mean, really nominal value, and for every 100 people that brought back one of these ceramic bowls from Mexico, 99 were broken, and the only one that didn't get broken is the one at Fallingwater and the one that Nelson Rockefeller deposited at San Antonio Museum of Art. So for the very vernacular, the very humblest things, it's sometimes the museum is the only place these objects do survive because they were used. And I'm sure for every bowl at Fallingwater of Mexican ceramics, there's 10 that broke in the suitcase, on the road, driving out there, at the party, or whatever, because the Tiffany vase, of course, they were very careful, but looks like one broke, Jeannine. I mean, it looks like maybe one broke. And so sometimes the worshiping of this very humble things it's a good thing on the one hand that it preserves them, but on the other hand, you ever break one of those, I'll find you one in the flea market, and about, that might not have the aura of the Kaufmanns about it, but would
Right.
be equivalent in every other way. So these things, yeah, it's funny how they develop an aura even if they are common in a way.
Yeah. Yeah.
I do apologize, everyone, but I'm actually teaching a class now, so I have to hop off because otherwise
Sure.
my students will be waiting on the Zoom and perhaps give
Okay.
up on me. So I better
Okay.
go
All
and
right.
do that.
Good
But it's
to
great
see
to see
you.
you all.
Thank
Thanks
you,
for helping
Glenn.
to celebrate Fallingwater. It's been a great session.
Great. We'll have one more question, and that's for Dave. And it kind of touches on your point in your talk about perspective.
Yeah.
No, I spent a lot of time with you in the house, taking some of these photos, and we had a moment where we kind of sat down on the furniture, because, like a lot of these objects in the house itself becomes kind of a precious thing. And you don't really understand a lot of Wright's architecture unless you're sort of at an eye level where, you're seated and you're able to look out, as he intended. You're not standing looking through a window, you're sitting looking through a window. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts were and how that might have changed some of your understanding of the house by doing that, by just sitting.
Yeah, it was pivotal in the way that you see the exterior views of the house. And I feel like how they were more thought of being seen. Because when you sit, you see more treetop canopies, and it just changes everything because it feels natural in that house to be that low to the floor. And I know if you'd go to many of our houses and you sat down at that low on the floor, it would feel awkward because you're real close to the floor. So being able to spend time viewing the house from that perspective really changed the way that I saw how and why the house was built the way that it was, why the windows are the height they are, why they're, laid out that the way they are. You can really start to see the angles that I think you were meant to see when you do it that way.
Great, thank you. I think that's probably going to be it, Justin. I don't know if you have
All
any
right.
closing
Well,
thoughts.
yeah, I'll just do a quick close here and thank our speakers for exceptional presentations today. And many of them opened our eyes to stories that we didn't know about before. So hopefully all of the participants that signed on to join us today learned something new about Fallingwater. And today's proceedings were recorded, so pretty soon they'll be available on our website. So just go to fallingwater.org into the programs section of our website, and you'll find our webinar recordings there. They're also on our YouTube channel. And for those of you that would like to purchase a copy of Fallingwater Living with and in Art, it's available at our museum store. And that's also an easy link from our website, fallingwater.org. So to those that are left, Dave, Jeannine, James, thank you so much for today's presentations and for being such wonderful partners in this project. The scholarship is tremendous, and we're also very proud of the end result. And Scott, thank you for all of your hard work on bringing it to life. So
Great.
appreciate you all. Thank
Great.
you.
Thanks
Thanks to all that
everyone.
signed on and
Thank you.
joined us
Thank you,
today.
everyone.
Bye-bye.